The song began many years ago. A glorious paradise was ruled by a just and powerful king. His gardens were magnificent, overflowing with wonders untold. Beautiful flowers, stately trees, and glistening waterfalls decorated its vast expanse. Emeralds, rubies, and diamonds were as common as copper and stone. In the center of the garden was a dais of rich, dark soil, on which stood a tree of such pure, sweet fruit that not only would it quench one's hunger, but it would also give eternal life. Most kings of such prosperity and renown would guard their riches, always keeping a wary and vigilant eye for those who might seek to steal their fantastic treasures. But not so with this king. His kindness and generosity knew no equal. His greatest delight was to share what was his with others. So he fashioned a man and a woman to come and walk with him, to eat with him, and to explore his astounding wealth. There was nothing that he withheld from them, no path out of bounds, no fortune unshared. Except one thing. Next to the tree of life stood another tree. It was as spectacular as its cousin, but in different ways. Where the tree of life was lush and full, this second tree was ruddy and coarse, gnarled with time, yet still appealing to the eye. Its fruit was exotic and rare, unlike any other tree in the entire utopian landscape. It was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The fruit of this one tree, among all the multitudes of others, was to be left uneaten. For if it was consumed by anyone besides the king, a great and terrible disaster would fall upon the land. For years peace and safety reigned. But then a dissenter rose up, a serpent of forceful and crafty disposition. He began to question the benevolence of the king. "He keeps the greatest treasure for himself," the dissenter cried. The couple believed his accusations and wondered for themselves if indeed the king was withholding from them. In that moment, all the other trees became as nothing. The only thing that mattered was this one tree. The dissenter urged them to rebel, to take for themselves the fruit of the tree. One terrible day they did. The woman approached with steely determination. Though the tree of life stood before her, she dismissed its presence. Her desire was only for the second tree. Decisively, she took one of the hanging fruits and bit into it. Its sophisticated taste made her gasp with wonder and pleasure, yet it also filled her with a paralyzing sense of dread. She called the man, and he too ate. While the juice was still on their lips, desolation struck. A mighty rift tore through the idyllic valley. In that moment, death began to reign over the land, usurping the king's rule. No longer would they be able to eat from the tree of life. No longer would they be able to walk with him in the garden. And in that moment, for the first time ever, they knew misery and fear. Suddenly, feeling terribly exposed, they hid. They cursed the dissenter and cried out in their despair. The king sensed the chasm immediately. He staggered to his knees in immeasurable pain as the breach tore through his very heart. Through the roar, he heard their cries. Banished from the garden, they could no longer approach him or enter his presence, but he could still reach them, and he did. He came bearing some of the fruit of the garden: peace, love, joy. But he also brought something else, something far greater. He brought the promise that, despite the devastation that had been unleashed, he would find a way to span the breach. One day, they would be able to enter his paradise again. It would take time, and it would come at a great cost, but the king loved them, and love always comes for its own. Once, a beautiful kingdom was shared by a magnificent king and his people. But the people rebelled against the king, and a terrible desolation fell upon the land. The kingdom, with all its riches and splendor, was separated from the people by a vast and unbreachable chasm. Where once there was life, now there was death. Where once there was hope, now there was despair. The rift hardened with time. If there was any hope that it might recede or that the threat of it might weaken, it was dashed. The population grew. Parents produced children who grew up, married, and produced more children. Gradually, the wonderful memories of the beautiful kingdom faded. There were some who even denied that it ever really existed. The dissenter, who had first riled up the rebellion, was alive and well, and his credo remained unchanged, his fists still clenched. He hated the king and wanted nothing more than to keep him from having contact with his people. He knew that the king's heart was broken because of the chasm, and the king's pain was the dissenter's nectar. He drank of it deeply, smiling down to the final dregs, savoring every drop. But the king was not without recourse. Not far from where the garden stood, along the banks of the great southern river that had flowed near its borders, there lived a man named Terah. He had 3 sons. When one of them died, Terah packed up the others along with their wives and children and headed west. They settled in a city whose name meant parched. And truly, the souls of the people were parched, desperate for the life-giving water that flowed from the king's bounty. It was in that arid place that the king appeared and met with one of Terah's remaining sons, a man named Abram. The king was making his move in an epic battle for the souls of the men and women that now wandered, aimless and hopeless, over the desolate landscape. It was the first of many moves, and the king made it boldly, confident that he was strong enough to repair that which seemed irrevocably ruined. The dissenter watched with a sneer on his face. "He sides with fools and weaklings," he mocked. But the king ignored the wicked jibes. Instead, he called Abram friend and began the greatest rescue attempt to ever occur on earth. Once, a great kingdom had existed on earth, ruled by a wise and loving king. The dissenter, a vile enemy of the king, instigated a rebellion, severely damaging the kingdom and creating an uncrossable rift between the king and his beloved people. The king, however, was not about to lie down and give up. His love for his people was fierce, and he had great power of his own. He selected one man, an individual named Abram, and through him set in motion a plan of rescue. It was out of this man's family that the solution to the problem would come. Months turned into years, and years turned into centuries, and the family grew. Sons and grandsons and great-grandsons, daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters. For 500 years, the descendants multiplied until they numbered over 1 million, like sand on the seashore, like stars in the sky. They flourished in the land and became a people of significance. But they also were heavily influenced by the dissenter's thoughts and ideals. For the dissenter still lived and was not through battling the king for their lives. His thoughts of rebellion seeped into their hearts. His hatred for the king tinted their affections. His lust for all things evil stirred up their passions. While the longing of the king's heart was for reconciliation, he had to make it clear that it could not come without change. As long as the people held to the dissenter's vile ways of death, they would never be able to enjoy the freedom and joy of the king's wondrous ways of life. The people had forgotten just how incredible the king was. Some stood up on their rickety daises and proclaimed themselves kings. Others fashioned pretend kings of gold and silver and worshipped them instead. the great king became just one of many, no different, no greater. He chose another man, a descendant of Abram, whose name was Moses. The time had come for the family to be set apart. A standard was given, a kingdom code of living. It stood starkly opposed to the way of life that the dissenter had been flaunting and peddling like stale and rotten meat at the close of market day. This new standard reflected the purity and perfection of the king's heart. If followed, rightness would reign. If followed, reconciliation would be realized. If followed, relationship would be restored. But oh, the difficulty in following it. The dissenter's ways and influence ran deep, and he was not about to give up what he had so wickedly worked for. Yet the king was even more tenacious. His eyes were set firmly on his ultimate goal, and no amount of opposition was going to stop him. A loving and wise king, a wicked and murderous enemy, a foolish and rebellious people, a great and terrible chasm, a bold and daring rescue. The king chose a man named Moses and through him presented a kingdom code of living. It was perfect and it revived the soul. It was trustworthy and fools were made wise. It was right and hearts were filled with joy. It was radiant, and eyes could see the truth. It was pure and would endure forever. It was more precious than gold and sweeter than honey, and those who kept it found great reward. But there were only a few that tried to keep it, and none that could. Great men and women arose, but not one of them was able to live the standard that the king set out. The dissenters' rebellion deepened. The people longed for the king's glory to be revealed. Then a man came to power. There was no one like him. He was noble and brave, honest and true, and his heart was devoted to the king like none other before him. His name was David. The great king endowed David with power and victory and success, and the king's people began to enjoy the seat of highest prominence in the world. Surely the time had come. Surely this great man was the fulfillment of the promise to Abram. But the dissenter targeted him. While David's army was off fighting wars, the dissenter was fighting David. And in a dreadful act, David embraced the dissenter's wicked revolt and turned his back on the king. It appeared that keeping the king's standard was hopeless. If David couldn't do it, who could? But David's heart was broken before the king, and the king's heart was tender towards David. A promise was made. One of David's descendants would come and set all things right. David had failed to keep the king's standard, but the coming child would be perfect in every way. The dissenter had oppressed the people since the beginning, but the child would overcome him. Death reigned ever since the devastation in the garden, but the child would bring eternal life, and the chasm would at last be breached. One day, the child would come. David waited and watched, but didn't see the child, nor did his children or their children after them. 1,000 years passed. The darkness grew. The people all but despaired. If not for the voices of a dedicated few, they might have forgotten the promised child. It is said that it is always darkest before the dawn. If that is true, then the morning was just about to arrive. It had been centuries, even millennia, since the Great Rebellion led to the devastation that separated the people of Earth from the great king who created and loved them. The dissenters' ways still dominated the world. Death, murder, discord, hatred, hopelessness, helplessness, despair. These were the words that characterized the dissenters' rule. He had his way for so long that it seemed like it would never end. But things aren't always what they seem. The perfect time had arrived. Night was ending, morning was breaking. Over the people that walked and lived in darkness, a new light was shining. The promised child had come. But this was no ordinary child. The king's plan that he had formulated so long ago was beyond anything that anyone could have anticipated. No, this was not just a human child. This was Emmanuel, God with us. The king himself would come as a baby named Jesus. Man's maker was made man. Ruler of the stars nursed at his mother's breast. The bread hungered. The fountain thirsted. The light slept. The way grew tired on its journey. The truth was accused by false witnesses. The foundation was suspended on wood. The strength grew weak. The healer was wounded. The life died. He died like the hopes of the people had so many times before. The dissenter and his minions killed King Jesus, and they erupted in evil celebration that lasted for 3 days. But it was not to last, for on the third day something remarkable happened. The king rose again. He came back to life, overturning death, breaching the chasm. No longer would the people have to live in their hopelessness. No longer would they have to die in their failures. The king himself became the bridge. The dissenter looked on in stupefied awe. All he had worked for, the victory he was sure was his, dissipated like a morning mist. With a horrified certainty, he realized that his end had come. Now, the only thing separating the people from the king's wondrous paradise was their own free will. The king was not about to enforce his dominion on them. He knew that with his incredible power and might, he could make people surrender to him, compelling their obedience and coercing them with fear and intimidation. But he wanted so much more than their subjugation. He wanted their love, and love can only be given willfully. He did everything he could to reveal his love, but the choice to return it was theirs alone. To love the king meant life. To reject him meant death. This is a story beyond compare. There has never been a kingdom more glorious, never a villain so wicked, never a rebellion so devastating, never a situation so hopeless, never a hero so brave, never a rescue so complete. Love came for its own. The price for redeeming that which was stolen and lost was by far the greatest ransom ever paid. But the king loved his people. He loved them when they were just the man and the woman walking in the garden in the cool of the day. He loved them when they were as numerous as the stars in the sky. His love never paled or faded or thinned. He remained constant through centuries of rebellion. He remained true through millennia of failure. He never gave up on the hope of reconciliation, and he fought right to the end. For you see, the dissenter was not finished. In a mad and desperate rage, he made one last attempt to fight back. Gathering all those who embraced his rebellious ways, he marched against the king and his chosen few. They came in like a tsunami, hoping to sweep the king's followers away in the overwhelming flood. But the onslaught was doomed to failure, for the king appeared and threw down the dissenter, silencing his wicked voice forever. A new day had come. The king brought with him a new and everlasting kingdom, with all the beauty and wonder and perfection of the first. Once again, the people could walk with him in the garden. Once again, they could eat from his table, drink from his well, and enjoy his unfathomable splendor and wealth. It was just as he had promised when he rose again. He gave his word that one day he would destroy all evil, settle all the accounts, and prove once and for all that he would be the only victor left standing at the end. And if there's anything that is undeniable, it's that his promises are sure as the rising of the sun.